Great, great. All right. Well, before we jump in, so the point of this demo is to talk about the Jackalope count scheduling module. And I'm going to be talking about it in general terms and how it is used generally. There's usually a little bit of state-specific customization that goes on, although there doesn't have to be. But I'll make sure to note places where, oh, this is typically where we would customize things, things like that. Before I jump in, I just wanted to talk about some general concepts that are important to understand before I show you the actual interface to control those. The first is the way Jackalope handles basically the count cycles themselves. And we've got two objects that control that. We have cycles, and these you can count, you can kind of, this is analogous to most people when they call schedules. So cycles are the, in-year rotation of counts for a particular type. So for example, you might have a 6-year classification count cycle. So you might have a certain subset of your sites that you count every 6 years as a classification count. And you might have a 3-year volume count cycle, which a lot of people call their obsolescence cycle. They've got to count all of their main lines or their higher functionally classed roads every 3 years. And you can do any number of things here. We have some states with like they call like census year cycles. So years ending in 9, 0, or 1, for example. So we have a couple of states that for their really low, for their locals, they just count every 10 years basically. So a cycle, just conceptually, is just sort of that big picture. What groups are we trying to schedule here? We've got our volume groups, and maybe you've got some various things there. We've got some class groups and got some stuff there. So does that kind of make sense?
Yes.
What a cycle is so far? Okay.
Yes.
And within a cycle, you have n groups where n is the cycle length. For example, for a 6-year class cycle, you would have 6 groups. And each group represents a year, basically. And each year can have its own attributes and do things slightly differently. But generally, you can just think of a particular group within a cycle as being a year of that cycle. So we're on year 3 of a 6-year cycle.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Okay. Yeah.
And when I go into the user interface, we'll actually see things to associate to these concepts, and it might be easier, but I find it's easier just to discuss the high-level stuff first. And that's actually all I'm going to go into right now. Let's go ahead and jump into the UI. This is Jackalope. And we're going to use Kansas because they're set up, and I know what they look like right now. I think we have.
I'm sorry. What did you say? Kansas. Kansas. Okay.
Yeah. So I'm logging into Kansas's test database that we actually host here. I believe we have two and a half states using Jackalope, right? Jackalope scheduler right now. Kansas and Minnesota are on production. Well, they're using it, and then Wisconsin, where I think we're in the middle of implementing stuff from Wisconsin.
Correct, that's true.
Yeah, okay. So this is the main Jackalope screen. I'm going to ignore everything except for this blue button for now. So this is the count plan. You could rename the scheduler or whatever you wanted to. And here's two of the two concepts that we talked about. Cycles, which are the big picture ways of counting your short-term counts. Groups are the things that are within the cycle, so you would have 6 groups for a 6-year cycle. And then the yearly schedule is the output, and we'll talk about that too. So let's dig into cycles. So we're looking at Kansas here, and they have, looks like 5 different cycles. And I'll probably dial into Minnesota too, just to give you that kind of context of how different states do this. So Kansas has a class and weight cycle, which is 3 years long, and they have a local cycle, which is a 9-year cycle length. So presumably each site in this cycle would get counted every 9 years. They have minor collectors, which they count every 6 years. They have rural major collectors and all urbans, which they count every 3 years. And then they have state system and ramps, which they count every 2 years. Let me just show you another example. This is Minnesota, just to give you an example of the types of schedules. This is one of their test environments. So in Minnesota, they've got, I believe, oh, I don't know why I thought they had a lot more than this. So they just have, a you know, high functionally class 2-year one. They've got a 12-year for their locals. They have another local, which is a 4-year, and a metro, which is a 2-year, and a vehicle class, which is a 2-year. Okay, so let me just get into one of these cycles and tell you some of the things that are customizable for the cycle. So this is, again, cycles are the big picture look at your short-term count scheduling program. So of course you could name it whatever you want to name it, and you give it a length. These are probably the 2 most visible things about a cycle. It's got a length being how many years is the cycle, and it's got a name. We also have to anchor this cycle in time. So we have a base year, which is just an arbitrary year, where year 1 of this particular cycle started in 2000. So that's just an arbitrary year that anchors that cycle in time. So far, so good?
Yeah.
Okay. We have this counts carry over flag, which means if that's turned on and a count was not collected when it was supposed to be collected, it will carry over to the next year. Does that make sense? I always forget what this one is, and I have to read the thing. Oh, right. The number of years to find counts is a value that, so let's say you're in the middle of a 6-year cycle or something like that, but last year there was a special count. Someone wanted to do a special count at this site for whatever reason. Normally, that count would show up to be collected in this year, even though it was just counted last year. You can control that behavior with this value. So in what I just told you now would be the case. So you took a special last year. This year it's going to show up on the schedule because we have 0 here. If we had put 1 here, we would go back 1 year and make sure that site wasn't counted last year. And if it was, it would disappear from the count schedule this year. Let's just go to the groups. Okay, so remember, so cycles are the big picture and groups are the year-by-year look at what we're doing. So a 6-year cycle will typically have 6 groups. So like if we go back and just look at the class and weight, which we were, oops. Okay. We would see 3 groups here, A, B, and C. And because it was a 3-year cycle, if you recall. I'm just going to click on the middle one, B here, and we'll talk about what's actually in there. All right. So this is the group. So again, a group belongs to a cycle. In this case, it's just the class and weight cycle. Each year has a name associated with it. That can be whatever you want it to be. Typically, it's usually numeric, like this is year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, or it's a letter. This is year A, B, C, D. That's kind of your call. It's an arbitrary distinction, and it doesn't control when sites associated with this group are actually collected. So it's just you. Some people have actual, you know, more meaningful names there, but for our purposes, 1, 2, 3, A, B, C are fine. What's really important to us is the offset and cycle. So I'm going to just jump down here. We have a little read-only thingy here that displays when this particular group is going to be counted. So if you go through and you change this to, like, I'm going to change the offset and cycle. It's a zero-based thing. You can see all these years change. So the offset and cycle starts at 0 and then is the year number within that cycle. So year 0 would be counted in 2018. Excuse me, offset and cycle would be 2018. Offset 1 would be, you know, it's going to be counted in 2019. And of course 2 would be 2020. And this is, by the way, something you generally set up once and then forget about. Once you've got the cycles and groups set up, at that point, your management task becomes something different, which is making sure sites get associated to the right groups. And I'll talk about this in a second. So there won't be a test on this. This is something you just have to remember once and then forget about it, basically. I'm going to do something here also. So account group can also have a duration, and this is years. So I'm going to put the duration to 2 here just for a second, and you can see how the years here change. So basically, durations, we implemented durations for one of our states that basically throws a list at a local, so like an MPO or something like that, and says you've got 3 years to count this. And then the local is responsible for actually figuring out when they're going to do it and things like that. And so from the state's perspective, you know, they assign those sites to one of these groups that has a duration of something greater than 1. And it will show up on the state schedule on 2020 and on 2021, unless it had been counted in 2020. So this may not be something that you even care about. That's a situation unique to this one client. I've never seen it before, but just so you know, that is something you can do if you wanted to. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Priority is for when groups collide. So let's say you have a site on a 6-year cycle and you have that same site on a 3-year cycle. The 6-year cycle happens to be a class cycle, and the 3-year cycle happens to be a volume cycle. There's going to be, you know, every 6 years, there's going to be conflict, right? That site's going to show up on the volume schedule, and it's going to show up in the class schedule at the same time. The priority is where you say, oh, when there's that conflict, I want it to be a class count, right?
Okay.
Does that make sense? Priority 1's the highest, and it goes down from, or up. Priorities go down as you go up, whatever. You know what I mean? Number 1 priority is the top priority. Number 2 is the second. And actually, yeah, I happen to be on a class cycle here, and yeah, you can see. So they've got this set up so that if this wins, or if this conflicts, that this group will win. Actually, this count type is just a text that you can put in whatever the heck you want there. In fact, I'm going to say all people use that to determine what sort of count it needs to be. You know, is it a class, is it a volume, turning movement, or something like that? And I'm going to go a different route. Then at the bottom, you do have a big list of what sites belong to this particular group. These are Kansas-specific names, so they don't have any, you know, you would see your 000 dot or dash, you know, the big long number there, and not this. Yeah. And again, that, like everything, that's determined by your naming convention. So Idaho has, I don't know how many naming conventions, but you would see whatever was selected here. We're looking at FHWA ID, which is what they use, I think, as their primary thing. And you can also view that on a map, I believe. If we have Latin longs, which I'm not sure we do there. I'm gonna go with no. So that's cycles and groups. Any questions so far?
No.
All right. The next thing, and we'll go to the yearly schedule last. This is the output, and so far everything we've talked about is not state specific. Everything is the same for everybody, and that will continue to be the case as we go. We had opened the site list before. I'm just going back to that site list here, and I'm just going to arbitrarily click on a site. I want to talk about how you actually assign sites to the schedule. And there's two things. When we implement the scheduler at your state, we will do a one-time load. You probably have a spreadsheet somewhere or something like that, or your IDA site that has all of your sites and what schedule they belong to. So we would do a one-time only load of that into Jackalope so that you don't have to go through one by one and do what I'm about to do. But for new sites, what you would do is you go over to the scheduler tab here. So I'm just looking at the site. I wasn't going to go through the whole site thingy here. If you guys don't mind, I'm just going to talk about the scheduler tab. And I happen to click on a site that is not part of any schedule right now. There's nothing, no schedules are assigned here. So what you do is you just pick the cycle and group that you want this to belong to. So I'll just stick with this local G, whatever that is, and I hit the add button. And then what that does is it basically places this count on the schedule. You see this null right here? I'm gonna actually click on this local G line right now. And what you can do, and this may be something Idaho doesn't care about, but if you do something like hand out your schedules to locals, you can actually assign a particular local to this schedule, basically. So when this comes up in 2024, they know KDOT is responsible for collecting it. Again, this may not be something you care about, but if you do divvy up your schedule at all and have other people, like you'll notice one of the options here was a contractor. There's a class contractor, I guess. So if you have various contractors that actually do the collection, you can assign who does what here. I'm going to go ahead and add another. I'm going to do a class and weight. Actually, this is the one we were looking at, class and weight B. So keep an eye on this down here. When I hit that, all of a sudden this changes because now this one site belongs to multiple cycles and groups. So in 2019, it'll be class, 2022, it'll be class, and then 2024, it's a volume. They have a 3-year class cycle, and we're on a 9-year volume cycle, so it's kind of weird. But that's how that would pan out. And again, you could select agency and say, oh, well, class contractor does all class sites. And then in the output, which we haven't looked at yet, you would be able to see who's responsible for what. So the whole point of this is assigning sites to a particular cycle, basically. If I didn't make that clear before. Okay, so we have our cycles and groups set up. We have our sites associated with a particular cycle and group. And now we can look at the yearly schedule. And this is where it gets customized. We have kind of a generic way this looks, and Kansas is kind of, with a couple exceptions, which I'll talk about, they are basically the generic version of this. So we're looking at the 2016 year, and this, by the way, is just stored from whatever LJ Wilkinson at hdtraff.com, whoever got in here last chose 2016 County Cheyenne System 1. But we're looking at what Kansas wants their schedule to look like. So their process is they do things by year, by county, and by system. And system is basically kind of like a functional class in a way, but it's slightly different. And so they filter based on those. So, and they have various rules, like if we go to a different county, like Allen County, you know, there will be different systems that are available. Got to do a little bit of thinking here. And I'm not actually going to get into those details because I don't think you care. They just have their own way of doing it. Let me just talk about some of the information here. So sequence number, which is I guess the number they care about for their class, or for their, excuse me, scheduling. There's also a station ID, which is another ID I guess they care about with regards to scheduling. Divided or undivided is important for them because basically, I'll show you in a second, but the way the field sheets are printed, a divided row would actually end up having two counters on it. So you would have two entries in their field sheets. But I'll talk about that in a second. And this again is totally Kansas specific. Idaho may have a totally different way of doing it. So this is, I'm just giving you ideas at this point. The description is just the location text. It tells you the last counts that were taken there. I'm not sure why we're looking at the 2016 schedule, but there's a bunch of counts in 2016, not surprisingly, since this was all these counts, all these sites were scheduled for 2016. And then it tells you when the last class was taken as well. And then finally, there's a status. And the status can be one of, I'll write this down on my notes here. I should just put that there. So I'm gonna, what's that thing called? Yearly schedule statuses. So good data means the count was taken, processed, and passed QC and jackalope. Okay, so all of the doohickeys that we were looking at here, all of these sites were good data. They were, we're looking into the past now. Normally, in a current year, you wouldn't only see good data. There is no data. So the count was never processed through jackalope. There is failed QC. The count was processed, but failed a QC in jackalope. Or you could basically tell the system that it failed. So basically this means that there's a note associated with the count that says no AADT. It's a no AADT note, and that triggers this status. So if the count was processed but had a no AADT because it either failed one of the QC and jackalope or because someone manually went in and said, oh, this is bogus, then that would be a failed QC. There's incomplete count, which is only one side of a split count was processed. So, you know, if it's a divided highway, you may have one counter on one side of the road, another counter on the other side of the road. Only one of those counts came in. So you've only got half of your actual site counted in an incomplete. And finally, the last is recount. So there's a way to, if something fails or you just want to do a recount for whatever reason, you press a button somewhere and then that status changes to recount over here. Okay. So last but not least so this is just kind of a helper screen for the people monitoring the schedule. the most important column for them generally is this one. But as they're scheduling at the beginning of the year, when their count season begins and they're handing out their schedules, they do it through this. They go through and select the county in the system and blah, 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 and then they hit this field listing for all button. Or you can hit the field listing. You could just select a couple of these and hit the field listing for selected. And it takes a second. And what happens is a PDF is generated for all the counts this person is supposed to take. There's basically two different paradigms that I've noticed. There's either the so this is what the user gets after clicking that button. Sorry, give me a second to look for something. I picked a lousy, okay, that's it. So this particular one doesn't have any of the divided, undivided. I was going to show you how that worked, but I don't know if that's even an issue with you guys. But so this is what Kansas wants to give their field crew. So they'll get this basically spreadsheet looking thing, and essentially the field person will fill out this right side of it. This is one way some of our users do it. The other way, and I'm trying to remember which way Idaho is, they will produce 1 page per count, and there's typically like a road diagram area where you actually, scribble in what the road looks like and where you place the counter, as well as other information, of course, about the date and stuff like that. I'm not sure which direction Idaho is. I forgot. I think I knew that at one point, but I've forgotten. But this is where we're definitely talking about customization for you guys, probably, unless this was like, oh, perfect for you guys. But the other paradigm I'm talking about is you do field listing for all here, and instead of getting a 4-page document, which is what this is, you'd get a 64-page document, one for each site that needed to be counted, and each field, it would just be your field sheets. And trying to think, I believe that covers everything. Typically, like I said, we'll start off and we'll make sure you don't have to go through and edit 60,000 sites to get them into the right groups and cycles. So actually, let me back up. Normally what we do is we train you like this. And then we ask you to go through and create the cycles and groups yourselves. And we'll obviously help you with that as you need to. But once the cycles and groups are there, then we ask for a source of information for associating sites to the cycles and groups. And we can write a quick script to just do all that so that all of your sites are then associated with a particular cycle and group. And then there's usually some coding that has to go on. At the very least, you guys have your own field sheets that you want this to output, and we would be producing that field sheet. Minor things like Kansas wanted the ability to filter by county and what they call their system. That's all pretty trivial stuff. But that's something that would just need to be discussed.